Hello and welcome to the course Social Behavior and the Brain, an introduction to social neuroscience. I am Dr. Ark Verma, an associate professor at the Department of Cognitive Science, IIT Kanpur. We are in the week 5 of the course where we are trying to understand and perceive social outgroups. And in this lecture, we will talk in some detail about what are the different neural and mental processes that are involved in perceiving social outgroups. Now, we have actually already introduced the idea of an in-group versus an out-group. What is an in-group? An in-group is a group based on similarity, based on some common shared source of identity. For example, if I were to define my in-group, I could define my in-group by by gender, by the state that I am living in, by the profession that I am in, by the language that I speak, by my political ideology maybe. So, if on the basis of any source of shared identity, individuals can form their in-groups. And what is very important about what is very important to understand about in-groups is that people tend to favor the members of their in-group more than the members of any other group. More importantly, people have a specific bias for themselves, and that bias is a positive one, and that bias basically can extend to all the members of that in-group as well. On the other hand, anybody who does not, by the definition that you've chosen, fall into that criteria of shared identity is regarded as an out-group. For example, if I were to make an in-group and out-group based on gender, then everybody who is a male falls in my in-group, and everybody who is not falls into an out-group. Now, there is another very important thing that we have been talking about so far, is that people have different ways of relating to and interacting with these different out-groups. We saw the stereotype content model from Fiske, where they present that there is this two-dimensional space of warmth and competence based on whether an individual is high on warmth or low on warmth, or high on competence and low on competence. They will differentially elicit different kinds of emotions. So, people high on on both warmth and competence will elicit pride. People high on competence, low on warmth will elicit envy. People low on warmth, high on competence elicit envy, and similarly people who are high on warmth and low on competence elicit pity. So, again, just sort of was trying to revise for you that. Now, so while there is this idea of in-group and out-group, and what is very clear is that people favor their in-groups over their out-group, sometimes people actively discriminate against the out-groups also. And this is what we saw in the literature that in the previous two lectures, where we were reviewing the literature related to this concept of dehumanized perception. What is dehumanized perception? When people are extremely prejudiced towards a member or an entire out-group, then that prejudice sort of breeds some the basic emotion of disgust, and people actually fail to consider the mental or inner lives, the feelings, the emotions, the choices of this entire out-group, and therefore this out-group is deemed as a dehumanized out-group. You are not considering them, and there are several examples that I have been giving so far. For example, if you want to talk about your Second World War, Germany of the Second World War era, so Nazis were the perpetual outgroup, whereas the Jews were the perpetual outgroup, and the Nazis were basically perpetrators of violence and discriminations against this. And you can similarly go back to the days of slavery when you talk about, say for example, white Americans treating the blacks as slaves and laborers and so on. So, these are some of the things that we have discussed so far. Now, one of the things that we have not really discussed in much detail so far is how do we perceive outgroups? What are the mechanisms that lead us to perceive these outgroups? So, let us talk about them in a little bit more detail. We will basically try and review what we know so far, and then we will take you into a newer territory. So far, we have seen that Harris and Fiske talked about the most extreme form of outgroups, which is the dehumanized outgroups. We learned that both the mental and the emotional capacities of these dehumanized outgroup members are considered to be relatively diminished when compared to normal human beings, okay, or say for example groups that do not elicit disgust and then extreme prejudice. So, dehumanized outgroups are an extreme form of outgroup. We have seen in this stereotype content model that not all outgroups will generate or will elicit the same kind of disgust feeling and the same kind of discrimination, or in some sense overlooking the entire thing. So people do not mentalize about their outgroups, about these dehumanized outgroups, or at least they find it very difficult to mentalize or to empathize with these outgroups. So on the same premise, Harris and Fiske argue that the perception of the dehumanized outgroups should be associated with the activation in the insula. Remember, in the previous lecture, what did we find? We found that the perception of outgroups, or perception of the dehumanized outgroups specifically, is linked to the activation in the insula and the amygdala. Okay. So just talking about the insula, so Harris and Fiske argued that the perception of the dehumanized targets should be associated with the activation in the insula, and this is a region which gets activated in response to the emotion of disgust, and also perception of these outgroups is linked with less activity in the neural areas associated with the functions of mentalizing, attributing minds and thoughts to others, which is the medial prefrontal cortex. So the idea is that when you are perceiving these dehumanized outgroups, there will be higher activity in the insula and the amygdala, and there will be lower activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. And this is basically what a lot of studies around that time find. So in confirmation with their hypothesis, which implied that the dehumanization is associated with distinct neural responses that parallel the behavioral reactions of being disgusted by and attributing less of humanity to these most negatively stigmatized outgroups. So this is about outgroups. This is a little bit about the research of Harris and Fiske, which we saw in the previous 3-4 lectures. If you go a little bit further back, then on the same line, we found the research from Amodio, where Amodio disentangles the influence of automatic and controlled processing in regulatory processes that influence racial bias against outgroups. So remember, we talked about the fact that people, let's say when they are even interacting with a face, the stereotypical information, race, gender, impression formation, all of them get immediately activated, and because they get immediately activated, they can actually in principle influence the way we interact with these outgroups. And a lot of times, because in today's era, expressing dislike and prejudice towards others is not really the norm, and in fact it is considered unacceptable. So people try to regulate this. Alright, so people try to regulate their implicit biases and prejudices while trying to explicitly say that, oh, we are liberal and egalitarian and we want to treat everybody equal. So Amodio's research talked a little bit about that. Okay, he argued that the dual process models, the automatic and the controlled ones that we've discussed so many times in the past, basically when they talk about stereotyping and prejudice, are rather simplistic. So Amodio says these models are relatively simplistic, and he provides evidence for the fact that motivational and regulatory abilities are actually, they provide more nuances to the traditional model. So you basically can qualify the older models by adding aspects of motivational and regulational capabilities. For example, one of their experiments actually examined the responses of people who are all self-proclaimed egalitarians. So each of these participants said that, oh, I do not harbor prejudice, I do not want to behave in a discriminatory fashion, in an unjust or unfair fashion towards members of an outgroup, and and although there is a very interesting difference that they differed in whether their motivation to respond without prejudice was internally or externally motivated. Remember, we have discussed this in the past as well. You can be internally motivated to respond without prejudice because you are seeking equality, you are seeking fair behavior, you are seeking fair treatment and so on. On the other hand, while you may be internally biased, you may profess egalitarianism, you may profess liberalism, you may profess equality or equanimity for that matter by virtue of what the society will think, or say for example, as if somebody is monitoring you and they will note down that, oh, you've expressed prejudice and in that sense you are you're not a good person and so on. So if individuals' motivations to behave justly and fairly were actually due to the internal locus of control, internal motivations, then they performed much better in regulating and performing without bias as opposed to people who were trying to respond without prejudice based on just external pressures, and we've discussed these findings in detail. Again, just repeating for you. So, those who were internally motivated to respond without prejudice actually show a greater regulation of prejudice as reflected in the error related negativity than did people who were only externally motivated to respond without prejudice. So, it seems that the internal motivations, what you actually want, actually plays a very important part in how do you respond with or without prejudice to these outgroups. Now, Amodio's work actually emphasizes the idea that both motivational and self-regulatory factors actually influence our behaviors as well as the neural responses to others or these other outgroups. All right. Now, let's go even further back and then look at the studies that we were reviewing, Ito and Erlend 2003, 2005, 2007. And there is what we saw is the event related potential work with respect to face perception. And what did we find there? We found that stereotypical information or information that potentially can trigger stereotypes, such as information about race and gender and so many things, can actually get activated very early in the chronology of information processing. So, Ito and Erlend's work basically suggested that there is this N100 peak, which basically says that it is around about 100 milliseconds that this information becomes available to an individual when they are viewing faces of, let us say, the other community. All in all, on the basis of whatever we have seen so far, what we can see is that this work reviewed suggests that the processing of in-groups versus out-groups is associated not only with different behavioral tendencies, but also with distinct neural correlates. All right. So, this is what we have seen so far. Now, how do we perceive these outgroups? What are the mechanics by which we engage with these outgroups? Let us pay some attention to that. So, and again, something that is interesting about the studies that we have reviewed so far is that mostly they are basically examining responses to single cues, such as things like ethnicity or race or other things that you can make out through the first impression or the first glance. Okay. But again, remember, human social perception is not just a first impression thing. Okay, it is based on a number of information, it is based on a large number of social cues. For example, several social messages are simultaneously conveyed and encoded even from a single channel of communication, such as the face. So, when you are looking at somebody's face, it is not only that you are recognizing their identity, you are recognizing their race, their gender, maybe also judging their emotional expressions, making a sense of their intentions, making a sense of their dispositions. All of that information basically becomes available to you very quickly due to this this very minimal exposure. Okay. So, the face can simultaneously convey all of this information. Now, the physiognomy of the face, such as the facial maturity of the face, is in itself a cue that also influences social perception. You can get an idea of the age of that individual. See, these are face invariant features, these are invariant features. So, they will tell you some things about the individual. If you see the individual in different times, say for example, now and 5 years later and 10 years later, you will see that the face tells you the age or that the person has aged. Emotion expressions and eye gaze are also conveyed by the face, and they also affect social perception. Okay. So, let us consider the three, consider that what are the types of information that we get through faces, and because they will be a very important and a very pertinent information in order to interact with others and interact with other social groups. So, what are these informations? Facial appearance, eye gaze and emotion. So, there are three of these things, and we will talk about each of these three things, their separate effects as well as their combined effects. All right. So, coming to facial appearance. Now, facial appearance can actually be seen as the primary vehicle for the formation of intergroup perception. For example, when you are interacting with others, the first the first entry, the first window of interaction is when you look at the face of the other individual, And nowadays we use very interesting, very different terms. Say for example, vibes. I was not getting very positive vibes from the person who I saw, and that is why I turned my head and I went away. I avoided interacting with that person a lot because he bore a very neutral or a rude expression in some cases. So faces do tell us a lot of this information, as we have been seeing. Now, Ito studies demonstrate that early categorization based on facial appearance cues happens. It happens very early. Based on facial appearance, you can categorize an individual. Oh, this person is Caucasian, he is Asian, he is African American, he is Southeast Asian. You can get this information in your first glance of the person's face. Now, what does this information do? It tells you, or it biases you in certain ways. Suppose you are harboring a bias, and by the way, it's not only a specific race. For example, we are constantly talking about white Americans, but it is basically because the book and the subject matter and the most of the research that we are reviewing is about white Americans versus African Americans or the blacks. But a certain degree of racism, if I were to call it, is present in all kinds of people, and basically it is ideally it's not really a negative term. It's basically the cognizance of the difference in race between one individual and the other. So you notice that difference, that individual belongs to my race or does not belong to my race, just that much, okay, just that cognitions. But what happens is, because of the historical baggage, because of our semantic knowledge about the world and about how the world works and the trends and the fashions, etc., those kind of things, we tend to factor that information in our decision about how will we behave with this particular individual, how will we interact with this particular individual. It may bias us, it may give us some a priori attitudes. Oh, I am going to talk with an African American person. Maybe there are some cultural biases that I have been given or I have read about, or I don't know, I have got through somewhere, and it could be something like, oh, these people probably are less friendly, or they eat so much, or any random thing you can pick up, and nothing of that may be actually true. But the idea is, because the facial categorization can happen very early just by looking at a person's face, and it happens as early as just 100 milliseconds, it basically activates and it brings to the fore all sorts of stereotypes, all sorts of baggage that has to be, and that baggage starts intervening in your first interactions with these individuals. So in that same vein, in the same direction, Harrison Fiske tried to look at dehumanized perception or activation of stereotypes as a result of categorization as an in-group or an out-group based on facial appearance. So Harrison Fiske's work basically tells us that yes, faces are a window to, or are a trigger sometimes, because all of that information becomes available to you so quickly. They may be a trigger to activate these stereotypes. They may be a trigger to activate all of this baggage and the semantic knowledge and the a priori attitudes and the prejudices that we carry, and all of that comes to the fore. Amodio and colleagues actually dwell on the regulation of negative bias arising from the activation of such stereotypes. So they actually talk about the fact that yes, biases will become activated, the biases will get triggered, it is implicit, or it is part of our semantic memory, it is part of how we see and view the world. But then obviously we want to control and regulate these biases. Nobody really wants to, or at least I hope nobody really wants to be discriminatory towards the other person knowingly. So what happens is, the chronology would be that you look at a face, those biases come rushing up to your to the brink of your behavior, and then you try and regulate those behaviors. All right. However, it must be noted that since face processing is a form of visual perception, it must be influenced and constrained by the mechanics of vision as well. See, reading, for example, is a visual activity. Looking at faces, for example, is a visual activity, and both of these both of these processes are therefore constrained by how our vision works. So that just is a caveat that you have to remember. Now, social cognition also exerts a rather powerful moderating influence on how we see the world. It gates our attention in specific ways, it determines whether an individuation or categorization actually happens, and it also influences how individuals will interpret the visual cues they perceive. See, when we started talking about social cognition in this chapter, we said yes, social cognition and non-social cognition are different. We said social cognition is much more complicated because it takes the information from cues, the information from goals and intentions and agents and patients and all of that sort of is in the play. So obviously social cognition, what you understand about the world, what is your intention, what do you want to do with that information, what is the context in which you are interacting. Say for example, if you are interacting with a member of an outgroup in a very formal setting, I am sure your interaction will be slightly different than when you interacted with them, or you were interacting with them, let us say on a playground, or in a restaurant, or in a place where it is not really you are not supposed to be that formal. All right. It also gates our attention in a sense that, for example, based on what we want to do, based on what our goal or what our expectation from the interaction is, our attention will also duly get modulated. Okay. And another very interesting thing is social cognition also, or our idea about whatever semantic knowledge we have, also dictates whether we will individuate the other or we will just broadly push them into a category, and say, oh, this person is an African American and I know a little bit about African Americans, and this person might also be in the same line and he will also behave according to whatever I have learned about African Americans, or any other social group that you want to take. All right. Or for example, if there is something very interesting that you can individuate and you can mark that person separately and say, oh, I met a person of, let us say, the African American group, and that person behaved rather atypically and you were surprised and I was pleasantly or negatively surprised. I mean, does not matter. Okay. So social cognition moderates how the system of how the system of vision is operating upon these social cues, operating upon these social objects like faces for that matter. Okay. And early research indicates, just sort of taking this forward, this early research clearly indicates that race is very readily detected from facial appearance cues even as early as 100 milliseconds. I already said that, although there may be individual differences that exist in a way that they will influence our responses to this. For example, if you are internally motivated versus if you are externally motivated, if you really care about coming out as unbiased, non-prejudiced and so on, or if you just don't care about it. All right. So previous research has revealed that there is a very interesting effect. We were talking about individuation and categorization. So previous research has revealed a very interesting phenomenon, something called the outgroup homogeneity effect. What is this outgroup homogeneity effect? Outgroup homogeneity effect in the form of is basically a form of an own race bias in remembering faces, and what really implies here is that people actually tend to club together all the faces of that outgroup. They do not pay attention to the features, the identities, the differences and so on, whereas they process in much more detail the faces of members from the in-group. All right. So it seems that this effect may be moderated by the speed at which individuals are racially categorizing out-group versus in-group faces. So as soon as you see a African American face, you say, oh, this is an African American. You will see, by the way, very casual, there's a lot of casual racism in the society as well. So you will see somebody, people saying that, oh, I cannot differentiate between the faces of African American people, so all of them look the same to me. You will see here people saying, oh, all Chinese look same to me, or say for example, all northeastern people look the same to me, and this is basically nothing rather than the manifestation of that out-group homogeneity effect, or actually the manifestation of a very strong in-group bias that we carry. All right. So an interesting factor here, and why does this outgroup homogeneity really take place, is probably because people are doing this categorization rather rapidly. As soon as they categorize, sometimes they would probably in their minds shut the window off further processing. This is a Caucasian face, this is a African American face, and their decision making or analysis probably ends there. So and research has shown that the faster people categorize these outgroup faces, the less they individuate them, and thus they the better their relative memory performance for in-group happens. Or I think the better way to say this is that the faster people categorize these out-group faces, the less they would individuate them, and there will be less unique information to remember them by. And because there will be less unique information to remember them by, people will obviously remember the out groups much lesser than they will remember the in groups, and that is basically the asymmetry in the memory performance for out group faces versus in group faces. All right. Now, let us move forward, let us look at this other study. So, Golby and colleagues investigated this outgroup homogeneity effect by examining the sensitivity of the fusiform gyrus. So, all of you know, we have talked about this, that the fusiform gyrus is the area in the brain in the in the right temporal lobe that basically is specialized in recognition of faces. So, fusiform gyrus is a structure that is deemed to be specialized in encoding the structural aspects of face identity. So, identification of faces. When the fusiform gyrus is lesioned, people suffer from a disease called prosopagnosia, which basically means that they have lost the capability of identifying faces. Now, Golby and colleagues were looking at this the sensitivity of the fusiform gyrus to black and white participants when these people were viewing the photographs of people from the same race versus other race, all right. And after the individuals had viewed faces in the fMRI scanner, they were given a face recognition task as well. What happened? What do you think would have happened? Indeed, in line with the expectations, the magnitude of this memory effect was found to be directly correlated to the differential activation in the fusiform gyrus for in-group versus out-group face processing. So, remember we have seen the fact that in-group and out-group stimuli are differentially treated in the brain, that the out-group faces mainly or extremely demonized faces mainly activate the amygdala and the insula, whereas other out-group faces and in-group faces basically activate the medial prefrontal cortex. Here we are seeing is what we are seeing is that the fusiform gyrus is also differentially sensitive to in-group versus out-group face processing. Okay. So, on the basis of this finding, on the basis of this study, it can be concluded that greater fusiform activation is likely related to greater perceptual expertise associated with processing the in-group faces as compared to the out-group faces. So, when they are looking at the in-group faces, there is greater fusiform activation. When they are when they are viewing out-group faces, then there is lesser fusiform activation. Okay. Interestingly, intergroup contact has not really been found to reliably explain such outgroup homogeneity effects, and hence they seem to be driven more by an affective or motivated process rather than in non-incidental or rather than incidental cognitive process. So, it seems to be a more what you will call affective and motivated. It's more of a controlled process rather than an incidental process. Okay. Let's move on. Now, Hart and colleagues also found that in white participants, the responses from the amygdala get habituated more quickly to white faces than black faces, and this is in white participants. Remember, the authors offer a couple of explanations for this. Let us look at them. So, they say it could either be due to greater familiarity with the in-group faces, which leads to perceptual expertise account. So, again, if you have seen a particular kind of face more and more, you have interacted obviously with more in-group members than out-group members, and that probably leads you get a very good, become to an expert in looking at those faces, and therefore what happens is you get habituated with that. You start almost automatically processing those faces. But the other explanation is more interesting, which says that there seems to be a racial bias towards the outgroup members, which basically you can see is consistent with the more effective and motivated account. So, because there is this racial bias towards outgroup faces, I am not inclined to process them in any detail, and I am not therefore inclined to remember them for later time. Similarly, another study, Phelps and colleagues reported that white participants, although did not really reveal a difference in amygdala activity in response to black versus white faces directly, but actually showed a correlation between amygdala response to black faces and their implicit attitude towards black faces. Remember, we have seen that there are explicit measures of bias and there are implicit measures of bias. The implicit association test is actually an implicit measure of bias, and it tells us that the degree of bias or the level of bias people would have or show in this test actually relates to the degree of amygdala activity they will show when they are viewing these black faces or other group faces. So, this work suggests that responses to black faces actually result from a perceptual expertise rather than result less from perceptual expertise than from learned emotional or affective association. So, it is more of a motivation thing, it is more of a conscious controlled bias thing. Okay. And in the same vein, work has demonstrated that variation in responsivity to in-group versus out-group faces also appears to be a conscious attempt to control such racial bias. See, sometimes the bias is there, sometimes you are trying to control it a lot, alright. So, altogether if you see, these studies tell us that the kind of responses that happen when you are looking at a face, they give rise to categorization, and one of the primary modes of categorization is according to race membership, alright. So, and we have seen that it happens at a very early stage. So, the specific influence that the race prototypical appearance plays in neural responsivity to faces still needs to be examined in a little bit more detail. People have not really talked about this a lot. There have been a bunch of studies which have demonstrated that the modulation in the affective responses of white faces happens in response to black faces with contingent to high versus low Afrocentric features. So, again, if you look at faces and if you analyze them, some features are, say for example, described as Afrocentric features. Say for example, the shape of the nose, the shape of the mouth, the shape of the forehead, all of those are peculiarly different in the African American race versus the Caucasians, white Americans for that matter. But interestingly, these effects appear to operate relatively separately from race categorization. For instance, the differential presence of Afrocentric features has actually been found to profoundly influence responses to faces even when they were clearly categorized as white. So, again you remember we did a study where there were these mixed faces also. So, if even a white face has those kind of those Afrocentric features, people would be sensitive to that, and their processing probably gets modulated due to that. So, further neuroscientific investigations obviously need to be done to determine the role of such facial appearance cues in intergroup perception, and they may therefore help better to clarify our understanding about how the mental operations underlying racial categorization and stereotype activation actually take place. So, that is all from this lecture. I will continue talking about how do we perceive these social outgroups in the next lecture as well. Thank you.